Привет, witam na moim kanale, welcome to my channel. We do what we do, we say what we say, come on boy. Now we're about to react to the falling of the World War II. Falling of World War II, so let's go.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended.
Damn.
Or when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s, at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost.
Wow.
This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23.
Damn.
In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who are injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers.
Wow.
Over 400,000 died.
Whoa. Over 400,000 American soldiers died in the war. Yo, World War II was hella crazy, to be honest.
Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis.
Germans.
And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese.
Damn.
When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy.
Wow.
One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
Yo.
So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died.
Wow.
About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe.
Now, the European side, basically. I think Poland was the most affected.
Started World War II when it invaded Poland.
Yeah.
Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war.
200,000 soldiers. Yo, that is a lot. 200,000.
Most
That's
died
mad.
after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland.
16,000 soldiers, and this one is 200,000. That is crazy.
The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia.
Then I think Germany has caused problems in many of the countries, to be
France
honest.
surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes
So France surrendered.
deaths
Damn.
in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths.
Yo.
The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides.
That is man, Yugoslavia. I thought that Poland was the most affected in the war, but this is surprising.
But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is
So Germany lost 500,000 of soldiers while fighting US and British, and lost 16,000 when fighting, Poland and many countries. Damn, that's
known as
crazy.
the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Wow, that is a lot. 500,000.
But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front.
Yo, even more.
Germany's
What the heck?
unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering.
Yo.
The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return.
Wow.
POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US.
Wow.
And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Wow.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable
This is
Germany,
crazy.
killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
2.3 million German soldiers. This is mad.
But winning the war
This is
came at a
mad.
cost.
This is crazy. What the heck? Yo. All these soldiers, bro. All these soldiers gone. The numbers keep rising, and that was hell. Well, then World War II was really crazy, It was really crazy, to be honest. Because this is mad. Can't believe this. I was all thinking that Polish
8.7
people.
million is the official
Whoa.
tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million.
8.7. I was
To
here
complete the
thinking
count of
that.
European military deaths,
Whoa.
we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis.
That is crazy.
Hungary,
And I
Romania,
was here
Italy.
thinking that Poland was, basically the most affected.
When you put these
But
European
damn.
military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the
Oh
chart to learn
my
more.
goodness.
Pause the narration if you would like more time.
Oh my goodness. This is crazy.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
Now let's check out civilian deaths. So the first one was military deaths. Now let's check out the civilian deaths. Oh my god. I don't know how this is gonna
6 million
be.
Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other
okay.
countries.
Yeah. Okay, now I know why Polish people were affected by the war. Because their civilians were
Broken down another way,
a
about
lot.
half of
Basically, the
the
civilians
civilians
that
were killed
died
in
were a lot from
concentration
Poland.
camps.
That is why they were most affected by the war.
Over a million
So
died
now
in
that I
Auschwitz.
understand.
Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others
Wow.
died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
That is crazy. Yo.
Like
Civilians,
with the
killing
gas
civilians
chambers,
just like that.
Men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
That is real mad. That is real mad, bro. Like, oh man. Imagine 1 point. Oh man,
The
this is
Holocaust
too much.
also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed.
A whole lot of Jewish people were killed in
About
World
a
War
quarter
II.
million
That is
people with
crazy.
disabilities were killed.
And someone from
Homosexuals,
Poland.
Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the
That
label
is
of
why
Holocaust. About 2
Poland
million
was
non-Jewish Poles were
the most
killed in
affected.
German occupation.
because its
Some of it were
civilians
sent to
were
gas
killed,
chambers
and
at
this
Auschwitz.
is not easy
When you
really. I
combine
feel like,
civilian and
you
military
know, this
deaths,
is
over
so man.
16%
That
of
is
the
why
total
5
Polish
millions.
population
Oh
died,
damn, this is too
which is
much.
the highest percentage of
I
any
understand
country.
why they said they were, you know, the most
But not the highest
affected
in total death count. The Soviet
in
Union again tops that list.
Poland. I
losing
mean,
at
they
least as
were
many
most
civilians
affected in
as
the
it did
war.
soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German
Siege
forces
of
surrounded
Leningrad.
Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
Damn. Food cuts off between 2.5 years. This is
1.5
pure
million
famine.
people died as a result, mostly from starvation.
Oh
Mostly
my
civilians.
goodness. 2 years, no food. Food
Stalin's
cut off.
cruelty towards his own people was
Crazy.
partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities.
This is
He
real
would cause
crazy.
the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no
Collateral damage.
civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The
Wow.
intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war.
This is
When the
mad.
Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread,
Yo.
and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
This is
Let's
crazy.
step back and see where we are with the totals.
22
We just
million
counted about
people.
20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you
Wow.
add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million.
41 million people affected in
Then
one
we have
war.
the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan.
China.
On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
Oh my goodness.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists
the
opened the
heck?
dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed,
Wow.
which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
Yo man, my heart is bleeding, you know, like
But the invasion
damn.
of China only cost Japan
This is too much.
200,000 soldiers.
How?
Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official
Yo.
US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets.
Oh my goodness.
When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for
70
the war,
million people.
give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included.
Yeah. So accurate, but over 70
More
million
people
definitely.
died in World War II than in any other war in history. For
It's not really
comparison,
accurate, but
here are
I
20
mean,
or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record.
so World War II was the most.
Some of these are more of atrocities
Damn.
than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years.
Wow.
The world's
Highest
population has
body
grown
count was World War
significantly
II,
since the earliest
basically.
atrocities on this list.
This is real interesting.
If you wanna
Man,
compare
even
them in
Russia
terms
had a
of what
civil war.
percentage of the world died,
Yo, what the heck?
we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally
Probably.
speaking.
Probably. Wow.
When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But
I'm
the
really
data
out of
shows something
words.
quite extraordinary has been happening.
Wow.
In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore.
Yeah.
We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off.
Civil wars, yeah.
That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since.
All the wars. So World War II
And
had the
again, we
highest
can't
body
forget
count,
about
basically.
world
This is
population,
crazy, really.
which has almost tripled
Damn.
since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day.
Wow, this is
We now
pretty
interact
interesting.
with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths. But those
That
two
is
are in
battle
decline.
deaths they're looking here, actually.
Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us.
Yeah.
Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
Wow. You know, we just want peace in this world, you know. We just want peace in this world. Because we can't afford to have another war. We can't afford to have another war, guys. This is mind-blowing, mind-boggling. You know, we cannot afford to have it. As I said, you know, so Poland was the most affected people in the war and World War II, you know, because they lost over millions of, you know, civilians, and most of them were Jewish, you know. So yeah, you know, it's really crazy, you know, it's really crazy. It's a lot of people. Anyways, if you want more of these videos, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to like. We will do it, we do what we do, we say what we say. Come on, boy. Oh yeah.